Lift every voice and sing, to earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith and the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope of the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun, the one day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Slowly the road we trod, bitter the chase we run, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, and let our weary feet come to the place for which our Father sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path in the blood of the slaughtered. Come from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of a bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us unto the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places our God where we met thee, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world we forget thee. Sharing beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Good morning. Our opening words this morning are from the Reverend Margaret Weiss. Holy One, our hearts are weary, are tired, and are breaking. Our hearts are stretching as they are pulled and pushed, bruised and battered by all the suffering and the brokenness and the pain. Our ears are ringing with harsh words, with yelling, with gunfire that echoes in our streets and takes lives of innocents without cause. They're ringing with the affirmation that Black lives matter. Again and again, until this idea is manifested in our legislation, our communities, and our hearts. We have heard stories of equality and justice, but our eyes burn from the instances of inequality, racism, and injustice that illustrate that we are still so far from where we hope to be. Our bodies, our collective bodies, built for lifting one another up and built for holding one another in love, they're being used against one another as weapons. And the ammunition is hatred and fear. Spirit of life and love, in this time of dissonance, in this time of holy urgency, to help us find our voice. Help us see beyond this brokenness to a time of healing and true community. Help us to remember that the only journey toward healing is one that is paved with acceptance of responsibility and counteracting complacency. Ours is not a solitary journey, but is one taken together, bolstered by deep listening and so rooted in love. May we find the strength needed for the journey here, together, and in all the places where people gather for love, for humanity, and for justice. I light this chalice to remind us of the light of this community, of the love that holds us all, and of our deep interconnectedness.
Please join me in the recitation of our shared covenant. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
For most of my life, I've been working for racial justice. I'd like to tell you why. I grew up racist in Newark, Delaware, which was totally segregated in every way until 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education integrated the schools. My well-meaning Southern parents told me to be nice to the new black kids in my 5th grade class and never to say the N-word. But they also made it clear not to invite any black kids to come home with me after school. There was to be no socializing. Like most people in our middle-class neighborhood, we had colored help. Teresa cleaned and ironed and often cooked and served at my parents' parties. When Mother was out, Teresa would fix lunch for my sister and me, but would never accept our urging to sit down and eat with us. When I asked Mother why, she said, "Teresa knows her place, dear." When I discovered that Teresa had specially designated dishes to use for her lunch, I knew it didn't make sense. She could prepare our food and wash our dishes, but not use them? Even though I was starting to question some of these racist practices, they still influenced me. I remember with shame that when we couldn't find something, my sister and I would say, "Teresa stole it," and then we would giggle. When Teresa died of a heart attack, we were all really sad. My dad paid for her funeral. I began to realize that my parents' attitude to black people was complicated. While they thought blacks deserved equal treatment under the law and loved those who worked for them, they still saw them as inferior people who were dependent upon whites. My mother and father had inherited these beliefs, which had been passed down from generation to generation. Both of them descended from slave-holding families in Virginia. My great-grandmother was 7 years old when the Civil War ended. She remembered her family losing everything in the war and suffering terribly during Reconstruction. She was distrustful and anxious about the new status of blacks. She shared all this with my grandmother, who was then bitter and fearful of blacks. My mother, in turn, absorbed her attitudes. It was the same on my father's side. And even though my ancestors lost everything in the war, they continued to benefit from having been slaveholders. The labor of enslaved people had made them wealthy enough to be educated, so they were able to support themselves. They passed down an emphasis on education to every generation in my family. There were a couple of important things that pulled me into a deep commitment to racial justice. One was spending summers at Girl Scout camp in the 50s. There I experienced real friendships with African American girls and learned about Dr. Martin Luther King from my counselors and the readings that we shared. We sang This Little Light of Mine and other spirituals popular in the civil rights movement. All of this affected me deeply. The second thing was being in Lynchburg, Virginia as a college student in the early 60s. Lynchburg was as virulently racist a city as any in Alabama. I plunged into the civil rights actions going on there, knowing in my bones that racial justice was crucial work for Lynchburg, for the country, and for me. I've been working on it ever since, there in Lynchburg, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, for 25 years with the South County Coalition Against Racism and racial justice groups at church. That brings me to why I have hope for progress for racial justice now. The past months have brought about a fearful of powerful convergence of crises: COVID-19, climate change, a faltering economy, and racial injustice. Together, they have revealed the huge disparities in our society in regard to health care, housing, employment, policing, incarceration, and education. The murder of George Floyd seems to have been the last straw. People who were not conscious of racism or just didn't think it affected them can't help but notice now. Black Lives Matter, Surge, Task, and countless other groups are actively working in targeted ways to undermine racist practices in cities and towns all over the country. Many people in power are responding. Right here in South Kingstown, the Task organization, led by students and recent graduates, is successfully putting pressure on leaders in the school system to make vital changes in curriculum, hire teachers of color, and reform their discipline practices. The positive actions taking place now don't mean racism will be easily overcome. There will, of course, be those who continue to defend or deny it. But right now, there is more widespread attention and effort to overcome racism than at any time since the Civil Rights Movement. That is reason for hope.
Good morning. A few weeks ago, I was listening to a live NPR interview with a 74-year-old man. The man had been arrested repeatedly for standing outside a courthouse and handing out literature about jury bias. As far as he knew, and as far as those interviewing him knew, he wasn't breaking any laws. And yet he had been arrested again and again. There was no logic for his arrests, but they happened. And as the interview progressed, the man began to cry, and he began to weep openly. And he explained, I've been trying to change this system for 50 or so years, and it's getting clear to me that it's not going to change in my lifetime. And you could hear the heartbreak in his voice. And the interviewer felt it too, and so he very gently asked, what are you going to do the next time you're arrested for handing out literature? And this man this 74-year-old man who just stands outside a courtroom, he responded this way. He said, "I'm going to kill him." And when he said him, he meant the police. And complete silence ensued in the interview. It just got quiet on the radio. The reporter checked to make sure that he had heard the words correctly, and indeed, this is what the man had said. And so, a minute or two later, this interview was brought to an abrupt ending. And instinctively, I almost turned off the radio. I kind of just didn't even want to hear this. But then I realized I really wanted to know how it ended, what happened, so I kept listening. And I'll admit, I was shocked too. Well, the police killing of Black people is an unquestionable problem. Turning the tables and threatening to kill the police is also incredibly problematic. The white male interviewer found a way to distance himself from the interviewee, and he held up the rule of law, and he talked about, he invalidated any of the rest of what the gentleman had been saying because of the claim he had just made. The other reporter, a Black female, had a rather different response. She got very quiet, and then all she asked was this: who is the rule of law meant to protect? And as she said soon after, she too was incredibly surprised by the man's open threats of killing. But she could hear underneath that, she could hear the deep well of frustration and pain that it emanated from. And that's what she responded to with gentleness and with understanding. She imagined, and she said she could relate to, how one might act in ways unexpected and even unacceptable when they feel like there's no other way to be heard. And I keep thinking about Jesus, of all things. And in case you're not familiar with the passage, at one point, Jesus becomes aware that the moneylenders who are in power are vastly overcharging those who are already poor and in need of what we might call payday loans now. And the moneylenders were evil, and they charged extraordinary rates, knowing that the poor folks who sought the loans could never repay. And even more oddly, this is happening inside the temples with the tacit implication that either God or the state is somehow affirming these wrongs. And eventually Jesus just loses his patience and his temper both. And he walks into the temple and he starts flipping over tables, making sure to put an immediate end to the usury of these moneylenders. He used his body and his privilege to say stop. No more. The system wasn't working, and he knew it. So he forcefully challenged the system. And I'm utterly convinced that if Jesus were walking the streets today, it would be in a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, and he would be chanting, "No justice, no peace." That's the message of our time, and it's the message of our faith. Because it's the job of those with power to look at those forced to the margins and to work with them to change that. And let me be clear, I am absolutely, positively not advocating any of us ever do anything hostile with a gun, ever. But how we live in solidarity, that does matter. When the uprising, the movement for Black lives, took on renewed vigor around the world in mid-June, after the most recent spate of police killings of Black people, when that response took hold, it grabbed many of us and carried us along. We recognized that it had been the status quo for far too long and it could no longer be tolerated. And we protested and protested, with masks included, of course. We chanted again and again around the country and around the world. And the police responded with a show of force of their own, with riot gear and the National Guard, out to protect city after city from protesters who want nothing more than to be heard, to be treated as fully human, to stop the murder of Black men and women. I think that far most of you would agree with me. Then the demands emerged from Black Lives Matter. Defund the police, decarcerate the prisoners, set them free. And there are calls for the entire abolition of the carceral of the prison system, to do away with the preschool to prison pipeline. And these demands are huge and systematic to meet in size and scope the problem itself. But they might feel disproportionate and unfeasible on first look. Get rid of the police? What if I need them? Set the prisoners free? Some of them are violent and dangerous. For reasons like this, for many in this community and far beyond, these large demands ended the conversation before it ever really began. So today I want to talk about why these demands feel large, what they actually mean, and why it matters to us as Unitarian Universalists. So let's start with defund the police. Defund the police does not mean get rid of the police entirely. Far from it. I mean, yes, there are some like myself who envision a world one day where power over is exchanged for collaboration with, a very different world from the one that exists right now. But what's being asked right now is a transfer of monetary power and control back to affected communities. If you look at any city budget, you'll see that the police budget is 5, 10, or more times larger than any other item on the budget. Items like mental health or affordable housing are maybe 1% or less of that. As a society, we've shifted dramatically in the past several decades to building larger and ever better defensed police forces and ever poorer funded communities. So defund the police is just a call to shift that funding, to make public safety not defined by command and control, but instead by community-based care. And the rationale is equally straightforward. Police are called for domestic disputes, mental health issues, and other things that are not their area of expertise. So what if the funding existed instead to have a system of community mental health support? What if that's who you called when your kid or your spouse or your friend needed help? That's defunding the police. It's not a wholesale absence of police, but a reallocation of funding to programs that would truly build public safety and a transfer of power back into the hands of the communities who know best what they need to thrive. With that in mind, let's talk about what it means to decarcerate. Those same police, they're the ones empowered to arrest and detain young Black people, the ones filling the for-profit prisons around this country. We know we have an incarceration problem. From the preschool to prison pipeline, to the so-called school resource officers who have replaced guidance counselors, to the war on drugs, our country incarcerates people of color at a rate unheard of in any other democratic part of the world. We have far, far too many people imprisoned, and for far too long. So decarceration just aims to change that. It's not a call to set every prisoner free, but rather to look at our carceral system and ask who it's serving. Is it serving those held in the communities they come from? Is it somehow making the world safer or better? And who needs to be imprisoned and why? And this ties into the call to defund the police, of course. I want to give you an example. A friend is a longtime therapist in the federal prison system, actually in the state prison system as well. And she works at a women's prison right now. And she's told me repeatedly that every prisoner she works with is there, excuse me, for one of two reasons. Either they committed violence against an abuser because they had no other way out, or they have mental health issues that are impacting their life. And she says to me all the time, this isn't the purpose of prison, and it's not. The system isn't serving the people, either those that in prisons or the larger community. And one has to look no further than the detainment camps at our southern border, or even to the asylum seekers held at the Wyatt Detention Center in Central Falls, to know that the system is failing miserably. Knowing all of this, the Black Lives Matter movement is simply demanding that change. Change that our young people understand, which is why they're out there in the streets again and again, making it unavoidable that their demands are heard. And in the time of COVID, of likely contested national elections, and of climate change, it'd be easy to turn away from these demands as too much. And it would be wrong. Beloveds, we can change peacefully, or we can change by force. But change, as they say, is coming. Protesters are going to keep flipping over tables until they're heard, because they can't any longer ignore the evil that they're witnessing. Faith asks us to go to the margins, stand with the impacted, and be in solidarity. So too here. Because if we don't show once and for all that Black Lives Matter, then what are we doing here each week? Who would we be other than a safe community of comfortable individuals if we fail to be in sync with the movement of this generation? This is the work we've been waiting for. May we be brave enough to recognize it. Blessed be.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe shall overcome someday.
Our closing words. We Have a Dream by Genova, a 17-year-old Black poet. In the midst of disaster, we find Black lives matter, since none of the distractions can distract us from society's cancer. With the TV screen blaring, another Black kid's happy never after, we oftentimes wonder, when will we ever matter? In a world filled with privilege, I'm asking, what's the difference between me and you, if I'm made in God's self-image? Because of my pigment, I have to fight for my existence, just to get a fair shake at the table that I'm sitting. And it shouldn't be like this, it really shouldn't. I shouldn't have to fight just to be considered human. I'm only 17, but I'm really with this movement, because I have a dream that we could really do this. I have a dream where we could live free, independently from these cop-killing machines that kill my people like lumberjack do trees, with a gun they spray as if it were Febreze. I have a dream that one day we can stand united, become that one nation that others look up to for guidance, not the one that sits here in abrupt silence, but the one that stands here to end all the violence. For I have a dream that we can be the greatest. There's a lot of bad blood between us, let's just say it. And just because we had a rocky past doesn't mean we can't change it. It just means it's going to take a lot for us to make it. I have a dream where one day we will be like brothers. Instead of hunting each other, we'll look out for one another, become thick as thieves, and ride or die for each other. I have a dream, a large dream that I have conceived. Just because it's large does not mean that it's out of our reach. It just means it's going to take a lot for us to achieve, to live in this grand world made of peace when we finally reach our dream.
Carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. Carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. Carry the flame of peace and love until